I'm going to start by talking about a term that's much in the news on our lips these days, by way of entering into what I think an unsentimental education is and what I think they offer for us. So I pulled a few headlines from the last couple of years. So this one just made me laugh. Empathy, the most valuable tool they teach at Harvard Business School. I am sure that's not why anyone goes to Harvard Business School. But it says something about the cachet of the term, which I have some interest in. Then The Guardian tells us in 2017, we're overdosing on empathy. And the New York Times Magazine tells us empathy is dead in American politics. So I just want to suggest that we probably don't know what we're talking about when we use the term empathy. And we have enormously high expectations, whether we think it's dead and we're mourning its loss, or whether we think we're oversaturated with it. We have some extraordinarily high expectations for what empathy does for us as a polity and as individual human beings or business leaders. And I want to say this is a mark of that confusion. In Syria attack, Trump's heart came first. This is the New York Times in 2017. It's just mind-boggling to me that you can equate attack and heart without blinking, that you can craft this headline. So I want to talk today about what I think that this problem with empathy dates back many decades. This incoherence about it, this expectation for it, dates back really to the end of the war. Empathy doesn't take on the meaning we have for it now as the deep understanding and sharing of feelings between people until 1946, and it starts out in a little psychology article, and its usage skyrockets from then on. It started out as a term of aesthetics, which was entering so fully into an object, like a Grecian urn, not a person, that you wholly inhabited it and understood it in some way. So what I want to think about is that we have given over empathy as the intellectual or ethical posture. And I want to say that there's something to be learned here among this, what I'm calling a school of the unsentimental, about an ethics that doesn't have to rely on empathy and that might avoid it, and for what reasons. So I'm going to just walk you through the people in the book because I'm not anticipating all of you know all of them, and just briefly. This is Simone Weil. She's the one I expect to be the least well-known of the 6 of them in the book. This is a picture taken from her time fighting in the Spanish Civil War. Fighting's not really the word for it because she stepped in a pot of boiling oil and burned herself and had to be sent back to France. She was a French Jew from Paris who became a Christian mystic and was a very powerful, enormously powerful writer. I'm really interested in what happens when her work arrives in the US in the early 1950s. Camus was her literary executor, and her work started to get published in English, translated first of all by Mary McCarthy that came out in 1946, but then in 1951. So I'm interested in the career of her thought here in the United States. I'm also interested in Diane Arbus. Diane Arbus is on the left, obviously. That's one of her very famous photographs of young man with curlers. And she is one of the most, if not the most influential photographer of the late 20th century. You would recognize her if you saw a picture of a giant with his small parents or triplets. Hannah Arendt is the most important political philosopher of the late 20th century, and you cannot have escaped her name in the last 9 months. Mary McCarthy is her good friend, who was also a novelist, an essayist, a critic, and Susan Sontag, who is the most famous intellectual of the post-war era. That doesn't mean she was the best, I'm just saying she was the most famous, the most visible, and she was a very, very fascinating critic of the arts and politics. She was a less successful novelist and also a filmmaker. Joan Didion, you will all know at this point because she's become a celebrity upon the publication of The Year of Magical Thinking, as Judith mentioned. But she's been a very highly regarded writer all of her career. She's a staple of syllabi in the post-war. And she's a pretty brilliant thinker too. All right, so I just want to do that because that's where Alan Thomas, who is the editor at the press, took the photograph for the book. And as you can see, we wanted to use their pictures. Every one of them is smoking. I just had to stick that in for Arbus because she didn't smoke. But we were trying to capture something of that, and also the work, the labor of writing in that cover. But anyways, I wanted to give a shout out to Alan Thomas because he cover for the book. He's the editor at the press. All right, so I want to just go to a little short discussion of sentimentality and unsentimentality. So empathy, if you look at a graph of the use of sympathy and you look at a graph of the use of empathy over the same time, they go in opposite directions. Empathy goes like this, sympathy goes like that. Basically, the two terms exchanged places. And I think, but they carry a lot of the same things. But the point is, in showing you this little engram of the word, is that we know a lot about the sentimental. We use the word a lot. There's shelf loads of criticism about it, but we know very little about the unsentimental. And I want to suggest that the unsentimental is a thing. It's not the absence of a thing. And so if the women in this book were called alternately pitiless, cold, heartless, icy, clinical, impersonal, it's because we've attributed the style and the kind of method of their work to a personality trait rather than seeing it as a project with certain aims and techniques. So you have to separate out unsentimental from non-sentimental, which I think is something that deals with feelings but without cliche, in appropriate scale, from something like unsentimental, which has a certain set of ideas behind it, which I'll move forward with. So sentimental education is obviously what I was riffing off of there, and I just took a little quote from Flaubert to suggest where they part ways. So he called that book, Sentimental Education, the moral history of men of my generation, or more accurately, the history of their feelings. So I just want to note the collapse there between morality and feeling, which has taken hold fully in the 20th century, even the 19th century, where sentimental and unsentimental and non-sentimental also could have various kinds of meanings. They are absolutely bifurcated by the 20th century. Jim can tell you much more about this, and I'll let him talk about it because that's not my bailiwick. But I want to say that unsentimental is a kind of active, uncomfortable sharing of a painful world without the sharing of pain itself. So I'll give you an example. There's a little anecdote about Hannah Arendt and Mary McCarthy from the beginning of their friendship. And before their friendship, they were really not speaking to each other. They had met at a party. They had offended each other somehow. 6 years prior to this moment on a subway platform where where Hannah Arendt said to Mary McCarthy, "We have to stop this nonsense. We think too much alike." And I like to think of them on the platform thinking, looking out for the train, but not looking at each other. So that's the sharing of the world. In order to attend to the world, you can't be looking at each other and sharing your thoughts and feelings. So you have this project that brings you together, but is not shared in some way. You're left sharing this, but still fundamentally kind of alone. But what does it mean, and what do you need to do that? You can say that, but it doesn't actually turn into anything unless you have an understanding of how that might work. So I want to think about that sharing process as fundamentally aesthetic, that the Unsentimental project is a retraining of the senses. So I'm using a quote from Susan Buck-Morss, who summarized this in a way that has always shaped my thinking about aesthetics. The original field of aesthetics, not when you get to the 18th and 19th century and you start thinking about beauty. You're not thinking about beauty. You're thinking about knowing the world. The original field of aesthetics is not art, but reality. Corporeal, material, natural. It is a form of cognition achieved through taste. They don't mean having good taste or bad taste. They mean actually like licking something. Touch, hearing, seeing, smell, the whole corporeal sensorium. So that's a very different way to think about aesthetics than I think we typically understand when we think about it as questions of beauty and taste and refinement. It's really a question of knowledge through the senses. And both Hannah Arendt and Susan Sontag in particular were very concerned that we had lost faith in the senses and had lost faith in what Hannah Arendt called a sixth sense, which is the common sharing where those different impressions come together in a shared world, that we all see the world differently through our senses, but we bring it together to achieve some kind of consensus about what it is that's in front of us. Any questions at this point? Okay, so what is an unsentimental education? And that's what happens in the work, as far as I can say, as far as I'll explain, and I'll try to give you some flavor of different dimensions of that, what different requirements are and different practices that they engage and also advocate for. So why do you need it? First of all, as Judith said, we're really talking about the aftermath of an explosion of suffering. I'm using this Mary McCarthy quote just as a way to talk about the scale of suffering being so incommensurate in the perception of many artists and writers of the time that the tools of writing were not capable of registering what it is they were trying to represent. So to do the atom bomb justice, Mr. Hersey would have had to interview the dead. So when you're talking about the post-war moment, when you have 6 million Jews dead from the camps and 60 million people killed in the fighting, and so that includes civilians and soldiers, you have 20 to 30 million dead of starvation in the Pacific Rim, you have 250 to 300,000 Japanese incinerated in 2 minutes, one in Nagasaki, one in Hiroshima. You're talking about a scale of suffering that's really overwhelming. And a great deal of this actually goes underground for about maybe 12 years, 10 years, let's say roughly a decade. That a lot of this was packed down and put away. It was too hard to deal with to erupt in the early 60s along the vectors of empathy and sympathy, but more primarily empathy as a way to manage the suffering. And one of the first instances of this is, of course, the trial of Adolf Eichmann. So I want to add to the training of the senses a training in the disciplines of representation. How are you supposed to go about communicating about this world? What kind of writing does it require? Or in the case of Arbus, what kind of photography? What kind of tools, aesthetic tools do you have to produce this painful world for us to share? So Susan Sontag, just to give you one example, Susan Sontag is very famous for writing an essay called Against Interpretation from the collection so titled. In it, she said, we need to experience the luminousness of things being what they are. So she was advocating a kind of arts criticism that didn't try to make meaning out of art, but tried to feel it, hear it, and see it. That she was wanting to get more involved in the sensual appreciation of art than turning it into symbols and meaning. But she said the exact same thing of Illness as Metaphor. Illness as Metaphor is a book about cancer. And she said in an article in a German newspaper, I was making the same argument in Illness as Metaphor as I made in Against Interpretation. And so I thought, well, what the heck can that possibly mean? Is she really asking us to see more, hear more, feel more when you're in the realm of a really gruesome disease? And she was at the time, as she was writing this, being treated for breast cancer. And she had had a radical mastectomy, which in the 70s meant you lost a couple of ribs, and was undergoing some really horribly toxic brew of chemotherapy in Paris for a good period of time. But in fact, I think it's the one through line of her career, is that she doesn't disobligate you to use that aesthetic approach to the world with painful reality. It's just as important to feel, hear, touch, and engage the senses and know the thing, the luminousness or just the thing itself, whether or not it's beautiful. And in fact, maybe especially so. So the same thing is going to happen to her when she gets to the 9/11 attacks and writes about them. She's still practicing that engagement that is brutally painful. So I want to say that one aspect of this work is going to be that you, the viewer, reader, critic, responsible citizen, are going to be uncomfortable in your engagement with reality. And this is true for all of them, right? You have to expect that if you're doing it right and you're doing it well, it's going to be painful. And they're not trying to comfort you. So one of their main criticisms of empathy is it's a form of comfort, not reality engagement. Right? So you're in fact shielding yourself against certain kinds of discomfort by doing that, by entering into the empathy frame of looking each other in the eye. The most famous example of the scandal of feeling is Eichmann in Jerusalem. Arendt, too, felt that we had lost touch with our senses. And she makes the charge to her reader there is to face reality, to face the reality of the camps. And she was criticized intensely for her failure to cover the trials themselves. So the trials, I don't mean the trials, I mean the testimony of the survivors. So the testimony of the survivors, for those of you who don't know, took up well more than half the trial. And Eichmann's testimony took up a much smaller point. She said, well, Eichmann, the question of Eichmann's responsibility is at issue here, not the suffering of the camps. And she was called heartless for this and for many other things. So when she said Eichmann was not a monster but a clown, people could not really fully understand that this was not a diminishment of the evil of the camp. But she built a whole career post-Eichmann trying to fend off the desire to look the suffering in the face, both the suffering as individuals and the experience of suffering, as a way to measure it and know it. She felt that was always going to be overwhelming. So the problem for her of heart was that, number one, it tended to run out of bounds. So she compares non-revolution, which she was completing at the time of going to the Eichmann trials, the overflowing sympathy or concern of the French revolutionaries with the poor in the streets of Paris. And that legitimized, that overwhelming feeling legitimized the forms of the terror. For her, on the contrary, and this has its own separate point, was that the founders, the US founders who were writing the Constitution and the Declaration, felt no such sympathy for the enslaved in the United States. But this for her was both a bad thing and a good thing. On the one hand, it proves that empathy, that pain is not mesmerizing in the same way all the time. It's unpredictable in where it's going to be motivating. And number two, that staying out of that loop of sympathy allowed for principle to organize those documents and could lead to a stable form of government. She was a great fan of the founders rather than the terror. She also felt heartlessness was or that the heart was often a code word for tact, that you should be more tactful, you should be paying more attention to your listeners' feelings than the facts you must account for. And so there were multiple dimensions of the heart. Finally, she felt that the heart was by nature hidden, so that every time you made statements about the heart, you invited charges of hypocrisy, because there was no way to verify it. It wasn't a shared thing in the world. It was something that you knew and had to divulge. So it always created some suspicion around it, and we see that all the time now. But so there were multiple ways in which she was trying to cordon off and even ban that emotional connection as a way of confronting suffering and turn your eyes elsewhere. So her good friend, Mary McCarthy, had a slightly different take on this, but Mary McCarthy called it facing facts, if Hannah Arendt called it facing reality, but it was exactly the same impulse, but it was understood in very different ways. Mary McCarthy called lots of things facts. She called Richard Nixon a fact. She called Brunelleschi's dome in Florence a fact. She called the door a fact. She called Charles Bovary in the novel Madame Bovary a fact. She called lots of different things fact. But what she meant was things that have the power to disrupt you. So she took Arendt's idea, and I really think there's letters of their exchanges. It's not spelled out the way I'm going to spell it out, but where they're sharing ideas about what kind of aesthetic practices would be required. And so McCarthy meant these kinds of encounters with fact, and she was very insistent that the only way you encounter a fact is to be disrupted by it. So that it's not unlike Sontag, it's not unlike Arendt, but she thinks all these different things, that we know something's a fact because it disrupts us. And I think about Mary McCarthy literally every day of the last 9 months, when we think about the discourse around facts, that this discourse is not new. McCarthy is complaining about very much the same things in about 51, when she wrote this prospectus to a magazine she was trying to start about our fear of facts. But she understood it as a fear of finding yourself alien to yourself. And she thought there were a lot of forms of anesthetics that protected us from that, one of which was ideological solidarity, that we didn't have to get disrupted by facts because we had an agreement among ourselves not to actually engage them. Anything that would disrupt our philosophy or our ideas would be impermissible. And so I think about that a lot too, is the way you have to be willing to have your consensus disrupted. You have to be willing to be alienated from yourself in order to actually deal with facts that are from this world, as she said, as opposed to plastic facts. Sorry. So I'm just going to walk through a couple more elements of this, and then we can have questions. So I want to talk a little about, Mary McCarthy is talking about facts and reality. Didion also was talking about the role of the writer in all of this. So she called the writer, I'm going to shift this, a secret bully. And she said the purpose of writing is to wound the reader, that you are meant to do the things that facts do, let's say, for Mary McCarthy. So she doesn't call it the syntax of unsentimentalism, but she actually makes quite a case about syntax, that in fact we spend a lot of time protecting our readers with evasions, qualifications. There's other forms of syntax here, subordinate clauses and qualifiers and tentative subjunctives with ellipses and evasions, is a direct quote, that we were using, that she said writers would work themselves into a cul-de-sac and then go limp. And there's a lot of kind of limp phallus writing about that she's using here. But basically, that the shape of the sentence itself was working to protect you from the information in it. And so you can see this in Didion's work, right? Didion's work is rarely qualified. The sentences are very lean and forward-moving, by which I mean she works mostly by juxtaposition. You'll think, the this, the that, and the that. That's a kind of Didion-shaped sentence, where she'll be piling up details. But the details then are just being sort of pushed at you, as if there's no editorial control of them. Now, of course, this is her amazing sleight of hand, because she is actually arranging the details. But she's very careful not to qualify. And so that the idea that the writer has a duty, actually, in her mind, to disrupt your comfort is something that is baked into the style of her writing, and that she advocates as a style. And so I think that you can see this if you're trying to say, well, is this unsentimental or not? There is actually certain stylistic signals that will tell you whether you're, the way you are being treated as a reader, as a kind of sometimes adversary. And last, I wanted to say, not last, but I wanted to say a few words about Diane Arbus. So this is a photograph of hers. This is called, he called himself Uncle Sam. This is from an essay that she wrote in the early 60s. It was actually her first, one of her first widely read pieces. It was in Esquire and in, I forget the other one, but where she had collections of eccentrics, and this was something that she was known for. But one of the things that Arbus spent a great deal of her time doing was working with the camera and thinking about the camera and what the camera can do to develop a technique that she thought could actually represent the reality of other human beings to others. And you might think, well, cameras just kind of do that, don't they? But she really understood that there's a social component of camera work where we're being too nice to take the photograph, or we're crafting the photograph in some way that is protecting the self-image of the subject of the portrait from himself or herself. So in that sense, she says there's a gap or a flaw in every person, and it's immediately recognizable, but somehow the camera's not picking it up. So part of this has to do with our desire to produce a picture that shows them as they want to be seen, rather than as they really look. And so what was called the kind of cruelness sometimes, or very often actually, of her photographs, was that she wasn't hiding the gap between expectation and reality, what the person is trying to produce as a self-image. She was actually very interested in kind of maybe zeroing in on it, but certainly not hiding it. And my argument is that, so this has been called voyeurism and all these other things, and I think it logically can't be voyeurism because it's not hidden. It was always available to everyone who saw the subjects of her photographs, and possibly including themselves. It's something else, and it's a way to kind of distribute that failure of agency over one's own presentation to everyone, right? That no one is actually exempt from that. And it's to sort of make those imperfections, those forms of helplessness or incomplete agency, a more universal trait. Now, it might be helpful to remember that she had been a fashion photographer, and that's how she got her start with the camera. And she came to loathe those forms of artifice in the fashion world. But she goes to a much different space once she's doing her own photographs. And the last photographs she took were of people living in what was then called a home for the mentally retarded. But her frank, candid photographs of them were deeply disturbing to people, and yet there's nothing actually distorting about the photograph itself. It's that we don't really have protocols for looking at those photographs. We're the ones who are uncomfortable because we want to make it right when there's nothing to be done. So I understand her as providing a useful pedagogy of helplessness, that it's not actually necessary, like your job as making it right needs to sometimes get muted and turned off in order for other people to be visible. Because she thought that empathy was actually a way to make the other invisible rather than visible. So I'm going to go to one last example from Simone Weil. This is very typical Simone Weil kind of comment to make. We must prefer a real hell to imaginary paradise. Simone Weil is a very strange thinker, a very beautiful writer, and very profound too. But what she meant was, or what I think she's doing in her work, is trying to take account of pain as a useful thing. That the secularizing of the modern world had made pain a thing that had to be eliminated or on its way to elimination. Everything was going to, all forms of pain would eventually get fixed. And her understanding of pain was quite different. It doesn't mean she doesn't want it to get fixed. It just means that's not the point of how we live in a society together, is to fix each other's pain or to make painlessness the goal of our world. Like, why would we want that as opposed to something else? So for her it would be justice, right? But why would we want painlessness to be the goal of our social life together? Because she felt that pain was the one certainty that we ourselves were not the world, right? It was the one check on, let's say, our egomania, right? That pain always is an expression of the limit of the human being, and enforces it in the flesh. So there's a lot more to be said about Simone Weil. I can talk about affliction if you want to, but it was her central idea that the crucifixion of Christ, that it's actually the experience of Christ on the cross that is the universality of Christianity, rather than the redemption. The redemption for her was a kind of consolation prize. It was the thing that made it tolerable, and it was also the one thing that was universal, that extraordinary form of affliction. So I want to just conclude by saying, so it doesn't sound completely pessimistic and dreary, because I actually find it pretty scintillating, because it has a lot of respect for your capacity to endure and your capacity to carry on. And the long horizon of the projects that you're in rather than their immediate solution. But they offered a difficult relationship to reality, and the true encounters that they're advocating left us without certainty. We don't know if our action is going to turn out the way we want it to, without predictability, and without consolation. But for all of that, they offered a vigorous, active relationship to a world that opened up the possibility of that world's transformation. Thank you.